So let's start at the beginning. After seeing countless challenges on YouTube on building a game in a certain amount of days, I decided to try and make a free-to-play horror game in 48 hours. With a few ideas in mind, I decided to start the clock. So here's the plan for the game. After you were riding your Segway around, trying to impress some chicks, you fall and hit your head. You get sent to a hospital, and when you wake up, you notice the place looks like your worst nightmare, and you want to leave. However, the doors are locked and you're bleeding out. In order to leave, you have to find a key, but you also have to keep bandaging yourself or else you bleed out. To make things worse, there's a demonic creature roaming around the halls, but he's blind. His hearing, on the other hand, is really good, so don't make any noise. Step 1 was getting a simple player controller working. It didn't need to do too much, but I wanted a crouch and a sprint. I had an asset I've used before, so with a little Unity magic, we had our player controller. Next was our monster. The hardest part was going to be setting up this guy so that he could navigate through the hospital with all the clutter that I was going to put into the map. He also needed to detect sound, so with his complexity, he was the first thing I wanted to work on. I really wanted to use the standard Unity nav mesh agent for pathfinding. However, I still wanted to use root motion to move him. Root motion is when the animation actually moves the unit and not an outside force. This leads to a really clean looking movement. The problem is that the nav mesh agent constantly moves, and with the slow walk animation I was going to use, it just looked funky. He was doing a forward moonwalk the entire time. The solution was to just use the nav mesh agent to get our rotation, and then we would use the root motion of the animation to move him. How we do this is we get our path from the agent and we look for the corners on that path. Whichever is the nearest corner is how we face our monster. Then we can just let his animation move him to each point. Once we reach a corner, we grab the next corner and rotate towards it. This way we can use the Unity navigation, but we can still get that clean walk from the animation itself. This approach probably wasn't needed, but I was very determined to get this working. Later, you'll see how this caused some issues for me, but for now, it seemed like the navigation was working perfectly. Next up was having the items make sound. The plan is to have the hospital full of items that you'll be able to knock over, whether it's an oxygen can or a shelf with bottles on it. I wanted distance and the type of noise you make to have different effects. Footsteps and bumping items would cause a lower sound, where knocking something onto the ground would create a larger sound. How this works is we create a method that detects what we hit. If we hit the ground, we scan in a larger range to let the monster know that a sound was made. If we detect a player, which would be a bump, the scan range is smaller. We then pass in this range of sound to the monster, and he determines how close he is to that sound. If he's about halfway of the max scan range, he runs to the target. Otherwise, he just starts moving in that direction at his slow walk pace. This way, the more sound you make, the more he hones in on you. He will always move to your last known position when a sound is made. So if you hear him coming, you have a small window to try and get out of there before he arrives. The final part was setting up the kill clip when he gets a hold of you. How I set this up is if he's close enough to kill you, we freeze his movement and we start playing his kill animation. At this point, we move the player camera to a position that's right in front of him with a small offset, and then we face the monster. This way, we get the perfect view for when he bites your head off. Now, we just needed a hospital. With some more Unity magic, and now we have a hospital. I'll have links down below to all the assets that were used in this game if any of you are interested in using them yourselves. This hospital was perfect for the maze that I wanted to create, and it came with a lot of items that I could just litter the hospital with. I briefly tested it out with the player controller to make sure the scale feels good. I then built a small section out and dimmed the lights. I also wrote a script that would have the lights flicker on and off. I think that gave a really good vibe to the whole thing. It should feel scary even if there's nothing inside, and I think it did the job quite well. Once I tested and made sure the monster could path around the hospital, I added colliders on his feet for footsteps and had him grow another foot or two because why not? I then spent the rest of the night setting up more items and their colliders and a good amount of time building out the rest of the map. It was a little past midnight on day 1 and I was feeling pretty tired, but I felt really good about the progress of the game, so I decided to call it a night. Starting off day 2, the focus was finishing all the items with their colliders so I could start adding sounds to them. Every item would have 2 sounds, a bumping into it and a knocking to the ground. How bandages spawn across the map is there's spawn points on every shelf, bed, and table around the map. When the game starts, it'll randomly spawn a certain number of bandages throughout these spawn points. Random spawning was crucial so that each time you play, the location of items is different. I did the same thing for exit doors, key spawn, and player spawn points. With this working, I started giving a sound to every item you would interact with. Nothing's gonna feel worse in this game than knocking over a shelf or a cart full of bottles. Footsteps to the player were added so that when you walk or run, you make noise for the monster to hear. Crouching allows you to move more stealthily. If you're low on bandages and bleeding out, it may force you to make more noise than you want by running around to find some. So the monster doesn't knock over items himself and set his own triggers off, I made the monster and the objects separate layers so they're not able to collide with each other. This means that the monster can walk through most items in the game. However, I added a nav mesh obstacle to all the objects, so even though he wouldn't interact with them, he still had to avoid them. Adding sounds for the monster was a lot of fun. I had a large amount of sounds that I used from a monster sound asset pack. I decided to go with these demonic sounds, which just hearing them when you're navigating the hospital is terrifying. I'll leave the rest for you guys to experience in game. After a brief lunch, I started finishing the player loop. I went on to finish the rest of the map and added a ton of items all over that you would have to avoid. Looking back, I probably could have just made a bunch of preset pieces with items already placed, but since the hospital maze was already finished, it was way past that point. So I just put on some music and started placing items all over the map by hand for a couple hours. Of course, every game needs a home lobby. Briefly set one up quick with a couple hospital parts and added some UI buttons. I started playtesting a bit and was actually able to beat the game once. It was hard, which was exactly how I wanted it to be. I thought everything was working perfectly and I would breeze to the finish line. This is when I discovered my pathfinding for the monster wasn't as airtight as I thought. After knocking over a bunch of items during the playtest, I noticed that the monster wasn't always coming to my position. So I tested out triggering all sorts of sounds and just watched him react. That's when I saw that sometimes he would be facing the improper direction, leading him to endlessly walk into walls. This is a terrible bug to figure out so late in development, especially since if the monster didn't act right, the entire game would be ruined. I spent way too long trying all sorts of things to figure out why this was happening. Even reproducing the bug wasn't that easy to do. So finding the culprit was difficult since there wasn't really any solid evidence pointing to any one thing. After spending a couple hours figuring this out, it was about 10:30 and I was fried. I spent 14 hours working on the game today, so I decided to get some rest. The next morning, I woke up at 4 a.m., mainly because I wanted to watch the Starship launch that day. After a few more hours that morning, I was finally able to fix the navigation bug. For reasons beyond my understanding, if the monster received too many calls to move to a location, his rotation just wouldn't update properly. I created a manual fix for it where if he's stuck, I could call it, which would recalculate his navigation path. This seemed to fix him every time. So now I just needed to have him call it when he's stuck. How I went about this is since the monster is always moving, he should always be covering distance. So every 5 seconds, I log his current position and check it to his last position. If we haven't moved a certain amount of distance in those 5 seconds, we call a method that just recalculates his path, basically an unstuck. This seemed to be the answer to my prayers, and with the monster up and running, I was back on track. The next issue I was worrying about was frame rate. Since there's tons of items all over the map, and a lot of them have colliders and physics, I was worried the game would lag. So I added an FPS checker that I could run in-game, and after a few tests, the frame rate was nowhere near what it should be. I have a pretty good computer, so the game on my machine should be running in the hundreds. If it's going between 60 to 100 on my computer, it might not be that playable on others. Thankfully, the first fix I did solved it, and it had to do with the lights. Since there's lights around the entire map, we're using a lot of processing power where we don't need it, which is 85% of the map you can't see. The solution for this was to add a distance check to the lights. If the player gets within a certain distance, the lights turn on, and the rest turn off. Just this one change boosted the FPS by about 3 times. Content with the frame rate and everything in the game working, I wanted to work on one last little issue that was bothering me, and it's again with the lights. The lights have 2 parts, the bulb game object and the light source. Since they are 2 different entities, when the lights flicker or go off, the bulb still remains bright. This is because the light bulb has an emission texture on it. To fix it, I was going to have to make the light and the bulb be in unison so that when the light turns off, it turns the texture on the light to black. So of course, I redid all the lights in the game. But the end result was worth it, I think. One feature I did want to add was the ability for the monster to hear your voice over your mic. However, I ran into a little bit of issues setting this up, and I just decided that it was already close to the 48 hours, and I really didn't want to introduce something that could cause a lot of problems I wouldn't be able to solve in time. If the game is popular and people do like it, I will do some updates for the game. So there'll be a link down below to play the game for free on itch.io if you guys wanted to check it out. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you guys like this, and let me know if you want me to add anything to the game in the future. For the last few hours of the 48, I just focused on fine-tuning everything and adding a how to play screen at the start. If you decide to play this, you will get lost, you will die. It's terrifying and frustrating, but I think it's pretty fun. If any of you do play it and beat it, go ahead and tell me your time. Ending the project, I did the final build for the game, which finished exactly at 2 p.m. The 48 hours was complete. Some of the things I do wish I got to was adding batteries you would have to find to keep charging your flashlight, and a random generator for the hospital layout, but maybe eventually I'll get to that. But for 48 hours, I think I did pretty good. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and with that, it's time for me to get some well-needed rest.